In fact, what we see today in China is as much the credit of the Chinese people as it is the proof positive of the importance of socialism for poor countries. That, as you say, a poor country cannot advance through imperialism. It can only advance through socialism. There is no other choice.
And by the way, I return to your idea of the Asianism. You must know very well, in the 1980s, early 1990s, this discussion of Asian values, especially advocated by Singaporean leader Lee Kuan Yew and Malaysian leader Mahathir. What do you think of that kind of discussion? Well, Mahathir today still thinks Asian values are important, very important, better than Western values. Will that be a kind of good grounding for your idea of Asianism?
As I said earlier, that I believe that the platform of humanity is more important than territory. And the concept of Asian values somehow reduces us to making a territorial claim, that something about Asia is going to blah, blah, blah. And I think that's actually cutting your feet when you need to walk firmly. And we shouldn't cut our feet. We should walk on both legs. So I don't accept it for political reasons. But as I said, that's a wicked kind of argument. I do feel that sometimes the discussion on Asian values is very selective in what is chosen to be placed in these Asian values. After all, even in Asia, we have some pretty terrible values. Speaking from the standpoint of India, we have the caste system, which is a terrible value. Why should we discard that from our discussion of Asian values? Look at the history of China. You can't say Chinese values are all great. You had some horrible things which the Chinese Revolution overcame. Foot binding for women, patriarchy, the patriarchal attitude towards women in China. It has a long history, but you overcame that through the revolution, through communist revolution, which said that, women hold up half the sky and therefore we don't need to bind their feet. All of that is about the fact that values are not good or bad. Values are historical. We struggle to make values good. We struggle to be human. One of the reasons I was very impressed by the histories of the Chinese Revolution was that the Chinese Revolution eradicated some appalling values from the history of China: landlordism, monarchialism, patriarchy, and so on. When I first visited China with my mother as a young boy, I was so amazed by the Chinese countryside, the lack of landlords. Look, I've read the Dingling stories, and I've read, stories about the wretchedness of Chinese landlordism. Dingling's stories are very similar to the stories of Prem Chand. They are contemporary writers, both, Marxist writers about the countryside. Both depict the landlordism and how horrible that was for people. Yeah. But the Chinese experience of the revolutionary experience overcame that. So that's why I'm not keen. I think that Mahathir and others, they are making a political point when they talk about Asian values, but it's not actually a factual argument, because even Singapore, when I first went to Singapore, I remember arriving in the airport with very long hair. I went to write a story for my newspaper, and I was made to take a haircut in the airport because they said you can't enter Singapore with such long hair. I looked like Gaddafi. I had really long hair, and they gave me a free haircut in the airport. That means that they enforced a kind of values: no chewing gum, no spitting, no long hair. Those values were not natural. They had to be enforced. So even Lee Kuan Yew, when he talked about Asian values, he was talking about a historical process. In that sense, why not talk about human values if we're going to talk about a historical process?
Indeed, I remember when I was in India, in Kerala, over 4 decades ago, at the invitation of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. We discussed this Chinese Revolution, the Long March, and Chairman Mao. I remember we discussed this idea, and China went through this enormous land reform. So Chinese farmers now have land. That's very different. Virtually in any developing country, if farmers don't have lands, they cannot have become better off. Simple as that. And also another idea from Chairman Mao, as you mentioned, women holds half of the sky, women liberation. Yeah, it's much more significant and really beneficial to women than feminist movement in the West. And I think that really sometimes we say, India somehow did not have its own Chairman Mao. That made all the difference between China's modernization and India's slightly lacking behind. Maybe that's one reason. We went through this social revolutions, land reform, and women's liberation. That's already now part of China's modern life. Yeah. So when we talk about these Chinese values, Asian values, we think of these what we call already modern values. Yeah. And then we can discuss them together with other countries, with other peoples. Yeah.
And one of the great lessons I think that we absorb from the Chinese experience is, well, you have to do two things at the same time. You have to clap with more than two hands. You have to build the productive forces, you have to build the social wealth, and you have to socialize it at the same time. This is very difficult. I think people don't seem to understand. When people compare China to the United States, it's not a good comparison, because the United States, after all, built its wealth on slavery. It's built its wealth on the genocide of Native American people. It built its wealth on imperialism in South America and the Philippines and so on. The Chinese experience has been different. There was no slavery in the modern period. There was no imperialist conquest of foreign territories, and there was no genocide of native peoples. And I remember when Xi Jinping took office, one of the things that was talked about was emphasizing the minority question, and that's the eradication of absolute poverty. I think this special experience of building socialism in a poor country needs to be recognized, and it's absolutely true. As you say, an end to landlordism, a real dent to patriarchy. Can't say it's ended, but it's been dented for sure. An end to the idea of social hierarchy, that certain people are better, or at least a dent to that. Yeah. And then building socialism in a poor country. I mean, these are immense lessons. And I just, hope that we can oxygenate these lessons, teach young people about them, so that they don't have an erroneous idea of, United States and China as if these are equivalent countries. They are very different histories. And those histories actually show in the attitude of these countries in their international relations.
Indeed, like you, I've traveled a lot. I've been to over 70 developing countries. And from my field observations, and China has more or less found a way. We call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. I call it the Chinese model. And then this whole range of experience for how to deal with the West, how to deal with the globalization, how to deal with Western investment in China, foreign capital, and how to achieve what kind of equality. We are doing, and we have conducting all kinds of experiments, some very successful, some less successful, but on the whole, the Chinese experience is successful on the whole, yeah.
But I would say that I agree with you that it's an incredible advance of the Chinese people. And here comes the main issue, is that without the clarity of the socialist project, it may not have been thus. That in fact, what we see today in China is as much the credit of the Chinese people as it is the proof positive of the importance of socialism for poor countries. That, as you say, a poor country cannot advance through imperialism. It can only advance through socialism. There is no other choice, and you can try your best to adopt a capitalist structure and so on, but there simply is not going to be the kind of investment necessary to diversify your economy. We see this glaringly in South America. And this is why I feel like so much of the next period is going to be focused on South America. Argentina, for instance, is being eaten alive by the International Monetary Fund. Argentina came to China, joined the Belt and Road Initiative, came to the People's Bank of China, got a currency swap, and yet decided, under pressure from Washington, to go for a new IMF loan. The Argentinians are going to find that their economy is simply not going to advance. On the other hand, if they integrated more fundamentally with BRI, and if they use those currency swaps, those renminbi peso swaps, I think different options would have been open to them. And I think the answer is going to be that the socialist option put forward by China and other countries is far more rational than the kind of false capitalist integration that really hasn't allowed these countries to advance.
I agree with you 100%. Thank you.